Leave now and pretend you're sick. The message on Emily Carter's phone read as the dinner table fell into an uneasy silence that no one else seemed to notice. Margaret Collins, 78 years old, sat at the far end of the dining table in her son Daniel's suburban Ohio home, her hands resting gently beside a plate of roasted chicken and steamed vegetables, while the warm glow of the kitchen lights made everything feel almost normal except for the way her granddaughter's eyes kept flicking down to the screen beneath the table. Emily, 17, didn't look up, didn't smile, didn't explain. She simply waited as if she was expecting Margaret to disappear on command, and for a moment Margaret thought she must have misread it. But the stillness in Emily's posture told her otherwise. Around the table, Daniel was talking about his upcoming work schedule, his voice relaxed and distant, while Lisa Carter, his wife, nodded politely at everything as if nothing unusual was happening at all. Margaret adjusted her glasses slightly, studying Emily more carefully now, noticing how tightly she gripped her phone, how her thumb hovered over the screen as if she was controlling something larger than a simple text message. "Grandma, did you hear me?" Emily suddenly said aloud, her voice bright and rehearsed, and Margaret blinked, realizing she had been staring too long. "Yes, dear," Margaret replied softly, though her attention was still locked on the faint glow of the phone in Emily's lap. The message remained there, visible enough for Margaret to recognize the words even from a distance. "Pretend you're sick, leave now." No explanation followed, no laughter to soften it, only the quiet clinking of silverware and the hum of the refrigerator in the background. Margaret picked up her glass of water and took a slow sip, not because she was thirsty, but because she needed something to do with her hands. Across from her, Emily finally looked up, and for a split second their eyes met, but Emily's expression carried nothing childlike in it, only a strange composure that felt rehearsed, almost practiced. "You look tired, Grandma," Emily added gently, tilting her head with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe you should rest early tonight." Daniel chuckled faintly without looking over, distracted by his phone vibrating beside his plate, while Lisa reached for the salt shaker and quietly changed the subject to something about grocery prices increasing in town. Margaret slowly set her glass down, her mind replaying the message again and again, not as confusion anymore but as something sharper forming beneath it. She had been invited to dinner. She had brought homemade pie. She had asked about Emily's school. And yet somehow, in the middle of all of it, she was being quietly directed to leave as if her presence was an inconvenience that needed careful handling. Emily's fingers tapped the edge of the table once, twice, like a signal, and Margaret noticed for the first time that no one else was looking at her anymore, as if the entire room had subtly agreed to look anywhere but her direction. The air felt unchanged. The conversation continued. The forks moved. The plates shifted. But Margaret Collins suddenly understood something she could not yet name, that she was sitting inside a moment where she was no longer part of the room she thought she belonged to. Later that evening, after the plates had been cleared and the conversation had shifted into the usual rhythm of polite family updates, Margaret Collins remained seated at the same place at the dining table, her hands folded quietly in her lap, as if she had not yet decided whether she was still part of the room or merely occupying space within it. The message Emily had shown her earlier still lingered in her mind, not as a confusion anymore but as a pattern forming with uncomfortable clarity, because now every small detail around her seemed slightly misaligned with how she remembered things used to be. Emily was no longer speaking to her directly unless necessary, and when she did, her tone carried a careful politeness that felt too structured to be natural, while Daniel continued scrolling on his phone as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Lisa Carter stood near the kitchen counter, wiping it even though it was already clean, her movements slow and deliberate, avoiding eye contact whenever Margaret looked her way. The house itself felt warmer than it should have been for a late evening in Ohio. Yet Margaret felt a quiet chill settling in her chest as she began to notice how often Emily checked the time on her phone, How often she glanced toward Lisa as if awaiting confirmation of something unspoken. "Grandma, are you still feeling okay?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice light but slightly strained, and Margaret turned her head slowly, observing how quickly Emily's expression softened into concern, almost too quickly, as if it had been rehearsed. "I am fine," Margaret replied calmly, though her eyes remained fixed on Emily's face for a moment longer than necessary. Daniel finally looked up at that moment, offering a distracted smile. "Mom, maybe you should take it easy tonight," he said, not unkindly, but without any real attention behind the words, as if repeating something he had already decided was true. Margaret nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she was beginning to understand that disagreement would not change anything happening in front of her. When she stood up to gather her things, the room grew quieter in a way that felt immediate and intentional, as though her movement had triggered an unspoken reaction from everyone present. Emily straightened slightly in her chair. Lisa paused her cleaning, and even Daniel's scrolling slowed for a second before continuing again. "I think I will step outside for some air," Margaret said softly, reaching for her purse near the edge of the table. No one objected, but no one offered to accompany her either, and that silence felt heavier than any refusal could have been. As she walked toward the hallway, she noticed Emily's eyes follow her carefully, not with concern, but with anticipation, as if confirming that something was finally moving in the direction they expected. Margaret paused briefly near the front door, her hand resting on the doorknob, and for a moment she allowed herself to look back into the dining room where her family continued their evening as if she had already left. It was then she understood that what she had seen earlier was not a misunderstanding or a joke, but a quiet instruction that she was not meant to question, and that realization settled into her mind with a cold, steady weight as she opened the door and stepped outside into the night air. The night air outside the Carter family home felt colder than Margaret Collins had expected, though the temperature in suburban Ohio was mild enough that she should not have been shivering at all. She stood for a moment on the small porch, her hand still resting on the doorknob she had just released, as if her body had not fully decided whether she had actually left the house or was simply being gently pushed out of it. Through the front window, she could still see the warm dining room light and the silhouettes of her family moving inside, continuing their evening without interruption, without hesitation, without any sign that her absence had created even the smallest disruption. She exhaled slowly, stepping down onto the driveway, her shoes making a faint sound against the concrete that felt unusually loud in the quiet street. Across the glass, Emily Carter appeared briefly near the hallway, her face turned toward the door, watching, not moving, her expression unreadable in the reflection of the glass. Then, just as quickly, she turned away. Margaret remained still for a moment longer, trying to understand what kind of instruction she had been given earlier that evening, and why it felt less like a suggestion and more like a carefully placed expectation. The phrase repeated itself in her mind again, not as words anymore but as intention, as direction, as something meant to be followed without discussion. She walked slowly toward the edge of the driveway, where a small garden lamp cast a soft yellow circle of light over the gravel, and stood there as memories from earlier moments in the evening began to return with sharper detail. Emily's tone when speaking to her, the way Daniel avoided looking up from his phone, the way Lisa Carter had stepped aside whenever Margaret entered the kitchen space, all of it now aligned in a way that no longer felt accidental. She turned her head slightly, looking back at the house, noticing how the curtains had already been adjusted in the dining room, as if the room itself had reset after her departure. Inside, she could see movement continuing, but it no longer included her in any visible way. For a brief moment, she considered returning inside, not to confront anyone, but simply to confirm whether her presence had truly become optional. Yet something in her stopped her from moving forward. Instead, she remained where she was, standing in the quiet driveway, while the sound of distant conversation inside the house remained steady and unchanged. Her phone was still in her purse, but she did not reach for it, because she was beginning to understand that there were situations where asking questions would not produce answers, only confirmation of what she already suspected. A soft breeze moved through the trees along the street, and Margaret noticed how calm everything outside felt compared to the controlled tension she had just stepped out of, as if the world beyond the house had not yet been informed that something subtle had shifted inside it. She took one slow step back toward the sidewalk, not because she intended to leave completely, but because she needed distance to understand what kind of space she had just been removed from. And as she stood there under the dim streetlight, she realized that what had begun as a simple dinner invitation had quietly transformed into something she could no longer ignore. Standing alone near the edge of the quiet suburban street, Margaret Collins allowed the stillness of the night to settle around her as she slowly replayed the evening in her mind, each moment now separating itself into clearer fragments that no longer felt accidental. The soft glow from the Carter family home behind her cast long reflections across the driveway, and even without turning around, she could sense that life inside continued without pause, as if her absence had already been absorbed and normalized. She folded her arms gently, not out of coldness but out of a growing need to steady herself, because the more she thought about Emily Carter's message earlier that evening, the more it no longer felt like a child's impulsive words and instead felt like something structured, intentional, and repeated in tone. Margaret began walking slowly down the sidewalk, her steps unhurried, as she recalled the years she had spent being present for every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every small request that had once made her feel needed, and now those same memories felt like they belonged to a different version of her life. She stopped beneath a streetlight and looked down at her hands, noticing how calm they appeared despite the unease building quietly in her chest. And she wondered when exactly she had stopped being included without explanation. The more she thought about Daniel, her son, the more she realized how often he had recently deferred decisions to Lisa without discussion, how conversations had become shorter, more transactional, and how Emily's presence in the family seemed to come with unspoken boundaries that had never been clearly defined. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, and in that silence, she began recalling smaller moments she had previously dismissed, such as dinners where she was not asked for her opinion, conversations that shifted when she entered the room, and invitations that arrived later than expected or not at all. Each memory now aligned like pieces of a pattern she had not been meant to notice. She opened her eyes again and turned slightly toward the house, watching as a faint movement appeared behind the kitchen curtains, Emily's silhouette briefly visible before fading back into the warmth of the interior light. There was no urgency in the movement, no concern, only continuity, as if everything had already been decided and her current absence was simply part of the expected outcome. Margaret took a slow breath, realizing that what unsettled her most was not the message itself, but the ease with which everyone inside the house had continued their evening as though nothing significant had occurred. She began walking again, this time farther down the sidewalk, her pace steady but thoughtful, as she considered whether returning inside would change anything or simply confirm what she was already beginning to understand. The neighborhood remained quiet, with only the occasional distant sound of a passing car. And in that quiet, her thoughts grew sharper, less emotional, more observant. She realized that for the first time that evening, she was no longer trying to interpret what others meant, but instead noticing what they consistently chose not to say. And as she moved farther from the light of the house, Margaret Collins understood that the conversation she had been part of at dinner had never truly been about food or family time, but about placement, boundaries, and a decision that had already been made without her. Margaret Collins continued walking down the quiet sidewalk, her steps steady but her thoughts increasingly focused. As the suburban street behind her faded into a softer glow of distant porch lights and sleeping houses, the night air carried a calmness that contrasted sharply with the unsettled feeling growing inside her. And for the first time since leaving the Carter home, she allowed herself to think not about emotions, but about details, patterns, and behavior that did not fit together naturally. She stopped near a corner where a small park bench sat beneath a maple tree, and she sat down slowly, placing her purse beside her as she looked back in the direction she had come from. From this distance, the house no longer looked like a home filled with warmth, but rather like a closed system where everything inside operated according to rules she had not been informed about. She began recalling Emily Carter's face again, specifically the moment earlier that evening when the message had been shown, not as a joke or casual remark, but as a directive delivered with quiet certainty. The more Margaret analyzed it now, the more she realized that Emily had not looked uncertain or emotional at all. She had looked composed, as if following instructions she already understood. Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting upward toward the dark branches above her, and she tried to remember the last time she had seen Emily behave without calculation in her presence. What came instead were smaller, sharper memories. Emily ending conversations prematurely, Emily stepping in whenever Daniel tried to ask Margaret for her opinion, Emily subtly redirecting discussions away from anything that involved Margaret's choices or preferences. None of it had seemed important at the time, but now those moments began forming a consistent pattern that made Margaret sit a little straighter on the bench. She opened her purse and briefly checked her phone, not expecting anything. And indeed there were no missed calls, no messages asking where she had gone, no concern about her absence, only silence that felt more meaningful than any explanation would have been. Across the street, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping over the pavement, and in that brief light Margaret noticed her own reflection in the dark window of a parked vehicle, seeing a woman who looked calm on the surface but increasingly alert beneath it. She thought about Daniel next, her son, and how easily he had accepted suggestions in recent months without questioning them, as if decisions were no longer being made through discussion but through quiet agreement elsewhere. Lisa Carter's influence came to mind again, not through any single event but through a steady replacement of shared decisions with private ones, conversations that used to include Margaret now happening before she arrived or after she left. Margaret pressed her fingers together lightly, not out of fear but out of recognition that something structural had shifted within the family dynamic without any announcement or confrontation. The message from earlier returned once more to her thoughts, but now it no longer felt like an isolated moment. It felt like confirmation of something already in motion. She looked back toward the direction of the Carter home again, noticing how unchanged everything appeared from a distance, how easily life continued without interruption, and she realized that what unsettled her most was not being asked to leave for one evening, but the possibility that she had already been quietly moved out of her place within the family long before that message had ever appeared. Margaret Collins remained seated on the bench beneath the maple tree, her eyes fixed on the distant glow of the Carter family home, as the quiet suburban street around her settled into an almost unnatural stillness. The longer she stayed away, the more her thoughts sharpened rather than softened, as if distance had given her the clarity she had been missing while sitting at the dinner table. She slowly opened her purse again, not because she expected anything new, but because she needed to anchor herself in something physical, while her mind continued connecting details she had previously ignored. There were still no messages, no calls, no indication that anyone inside the house had even registered her absence beyond the moment she stepped out. That absence, more than anything, confirmed what she was beginning to suspect. After a few minutes, Margaret stood again, adjusting her coat gently as she began walking back in the direction of the house, not with urgency, but with a steady intention that had not been there earlier. Each step felt more deliberate than the last, as if she was no longer returning as a guest, but as someone attempting to understand a space she had unknowingly been separated from. As she approached the street leading to Daniel Carter's home, she slowed slightly and noticed that the kitchen light was still on, casting a warm rectangle across the driveway. Through the front window, she could see movement inside, but it was not chaotic or concerned. It was structured, calm, and uninterrupted. She stopped just short of the driveway, staying partially hidden behind a parked car across the street, and observed quietly. Inside, Emily Carter stood near the kitchen counter speaking softly to Lisa, her posture relaxed, almost relieved, as if something had already resolved itself. Daniel was no longer at the table, and the remnants of dinner had been cleared away, replaced by a sense of closure that did not include her. Margaret narrowed her eyes slightly, not out of anger but observation, and that was when she noticed something she had not seen before. On the counter near Emily's hand was a small notebook, opened and partially filled with handwritten notes, and though she could not read the words from where she stood, Emily's finger traced a line across the page, as if reviewing instructions or confirming steps. Lisa nodded once, then turned toward the hallway, speaking briefly before disappearing from view, while Emily remained still for a moment, looking toward the front door as if checking the outcome of something that had already been set in motion. Margaret's breathing slowed as she realized that the earlier message had not been a spontaneous act, but possibly part of something coordinated, something rehearsed in quiet preparation rather than sudden emotion. She took one careful step backward, moving further into the shadow of the parked car, and continued watching without being seen. The house remained calm, but it no longer felt neutral to her. It felt structured in a way that suggested roles had already been assigned, and hers was no longer inside the visible arrangement. After a long moment, Emily closed the notebook and placed it out of sight, then turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the faint glow from the hallway illuminating the interior. Margaret stood still as the house dimmed, realizing that what she was witnessing was not a single moment of exclusion, but the continuation of a pattern that had been operating long before that evening began. Margaret Collins stood partially hidden beside the parked car across from the Carter home, her eyes fixed on the dimly lit hallway where the family had just been moments earlier, and now the silence inside felt heavier than the conversation she had overheard. The kitchen light had been turned off, leaving only a soft glow from the hallway that made the interior appear narrower, almost compressed, as if the space itself had shifted after her departure. She remained still, not because she was afraid, but because she was carefully observing what she now understood might not be random behavior but repeated structure. Inside, Emily Carter reappeared briefly at the edge of the hallway, pausing in place before speaking softly to someone out of view. Her posture relaxed but deliberate, as if confirming something already agreed upon. Margaret's gaze sharpened slightly as she noticed that Emily was holding her phone again. Not typing, not reading, but simply holding it in a way that suggested waiting for timing rather than communication. After a moment, Emily nodded once, then turned and disappeared deeper into the house, and the movement felt less like casual living and more like completion of a step in a process. Margaret's attention shifted to Daniel Carter, who appeared briefly near the living room doorway, looking around as if checking the environment rather than engaging with anyone, before stepping back inside without speaking. The entire scene carried an unusual absence of spontaneity, and that absence began to form into something Margaret could no longer dismiss. She slowly stepped away from the parked car, moving further down the street while keeping the house in her peripheral vision, and as she walked, She replayed every interaction from earlier that evening with increasing precision. The message Emily had shown her was no longer isolated in her memory. It now aligned with the silence, the coordinated pauses, the absence of reaction from everyone else at the table. Margaret stopped again beneath another streetlight, this one slightly flickering, and she looked down at the pavement as if expecting answers to form in the stillness. She thought about how no one had asked her where she was going when she left the house, how no one had followed her, and how quickly the atmosphere had normalized after her absence, as if her departure had already been accounted for in advance. Her mind now returned to earlier patterns she had once overlooked. Conversations that ended when she entered a room, plans that were finalized before she was informed, decisions that always seemed to align without her input being required. She exhaled slowly, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to consider not what had been said, but what had consistently been left unsaid around her. The quiet suburban street around her remained unchanged, with distant porch lights and still houses giving no indication of the internal shifts she had just witnessed. Yet inside Margaret's awareness, something fundamental had already begun to reorganize. She turned her head once more toward the Carter home, now partially obscured by distance and shadow, and understood with increasing certainty that what she had stepped out of earlier was not a single moment of exclusion, but part of a longer process that had been unfolding without her permission or notice. Margaret Collins stood at the end of the quiet suburban street, her presence almost blending into the dim glow of the streetlight as she remained still, watching the Carter home from a distance that now felt both physical and symbolic. The house no longer appeared as a place she had just left, but as a closed structure operating independently of her presence, and that realization settled in her mind with a calm but undeniable weight. She slowly turned away for a moment, walking a few steps down the sidewalk, then paused again as if she needed to confirm her own thoughts through distance. Inside her mind, the evening replayed not as isolated events, but as a sequence of coordinated actions, each one subtle on its own but increasingly deliberate when viewed together. The absence of concern when she left the dinner table, the lack of follow-up, the calm continuation of conversation inside the house, all of it now formed a pattern that no longer felt accidental. She took a slow breath and began walking again, this time not aimlessly, but with a quiet intention that had replaced her earlier uncertainty. As she moved farther from the Carter home, she noticed how the neighborhood remained unchanged, with neatly trimmed lawns, soft lily porches, and the distant hum of a television from an open window, all continuing their normal rhythm, while her internal understanding of the evening had shifted completely. Margaret stopped near a mailbox and rested her hand lightly on it, not because she needed support, but because she was processing the clarity that was forming in her thoughts. She understood now that what had disturbed her most was not a single message or a single interaction, but the consistency of exclusion that seemed to operate without emotion or hesitation. Her mind returned again to Emily Carter, not with anger, but with observation, recalling how controlled her expressions had been, how carefully her words were chosen, and how every interaction seemed to include a subtle boundary that was never spoken aloud, but always enforced. Margaret's gaze lowered briefly as she considered Daniel, her son, and how easily he had adjusted his attention away from her over time, not through confrontation but through gradual absence. Lisa Carter's influence now appeared in her memory not as a single force, but as a steady reorganization of family dynamics that had slowly shifted decisions, conversations, and priorities away from her presence. She continued walking slowly, her footsteps steady on the pavement, and with each step she felt less like someone who had been asked to leave for the evening, and more like someone who had been quietly repositioned long before that moment occurred. The streetlight above her flickered faintly, casting intermittent shadows across her path, and in that shifting light she realized that clarity often arrived not through confrontation, but through observation once emotional noise was removed. Margaret looked back one final time toward the Carter home, now distant and partially obscured by trees and darkness, and understood with quiet certainty that what she had experienced that evening was not an interruption in her place within the family, but a confirmation that her place had already been redefined without her consent. Margaret Collins continued walking slowly through the quiet suburban street, her footsteps steady on the pavement as the night around her settled into a deep and thoughtful silence. And for the first time since leaving the Carter home, she was no longer trying to interpret what had happened as confusion or misunderstanding. Instead, she carried a calm but unsettling clarity that had formed gradually through observation rather than emotion, and that clarity now shaped every thought she had as she moved farther away from the house. The neighborhood remained unchanged, with soft porch lights glowing in evenly spaced homes and distant television sounds drifting faintly through open windows. Yet Margaret felt as if she had stepped outside a boundary that was no longer visible but very real. She stopped briefly near a corner where two streets met, and she turned her head slightly as if expecting to see something different behind her. But the Carter home remained distant and still, unchanged in appearance yet completely different in meaning. She exhaled slowly and placed her hand over the strap of her purse, not out of fear, but as a grounding habit while her thoughts organized themselves with increasing precision. She began to understand that what she had experienced was not a sudden rejection, but a gradual repositioning that had been unfolding without clear announcement or confrontation. Each memory from recent months now appeared in her mind with new alignment, conversations that ended too quickly, decisions that were already made before she was informed, and moments where her presence had been acknowledged but not included. She thought again about Emily Carter, not with confusion, but with a quiet analytical focus, recalling how carefully she managed tone, timing, and expression, as if every interaction had been measured in advance. Daniel Carter's behavior also returned to her thoughts, not as a single action, but as a pattern of reduced engagement, where responses had become shorter and decisions had been increasingly deferred without discussion. Lisa Carter's presence now felt less like participation, and more like influence distributed through absence of transparency, shaping interactions without direct confrontation. Margaret resumed walking, her pace unhurried, as she considered how easily these changes had gone unnoticed while she was still inside the system of the family, and how clarity only arrived once she was physically removed from it. The streetlight above her cast a steady glow as she passed beneath it, and in that moment she realized that distance had not weakened her understanding, it had refined it. She no longer felt the need to question whether the earlier message had been a mistake or a joke, because the consistency of behavior around it had already answered that question in a way words never could. As she approached a quieter section of the street, she slowed again and looked back once more toward the direction of the Carter home, now barely visible between trees and darkness, and she understood that what she was seeing was not just the house she had left, but a structure of relationships that had already adjusted its shape without her. The realization did not bring anger or sadness in that moment, only a steady awareness that something fundamental had changed in how she fit within the lives of people she had once considered central to her own. She turned forward again and continued walking, her steps measured and calm, carrying with her a clear understanding that the evening had not been about a single message or a single decision, but about recognition of a shift that had already taken place long before she ever stepped outside.